They called it American black magic, but it was pure engineering genius. Soviet tank crews, hardened by years of brutal warfare, couldn't believe their eyes when they first witnessed Sherman tanks firing accurately while moving at full speed. What seemed impossible was actually America's best-kept armored secret, a technology so advanced that even veteran tankers thought they were hallucinating. The bitter wind howled across the Karelian Peninsula as Captain Svetlana Volkov climbed down from her battered T-34, her hands trembling not from cold, but from rage. For the third time this week, her tank battalion had been forced to retreat from the German positions around Medvezhegorsk. The fascists had turned every village, every crossroads, every frozen hilltop into a fortress bristling with anti-tank guns. Svetlana was no ordinary tank commander. At 26, she had already earned the Order of the Red Banner twice and commanded respect from men twice her age. Her crews called her Stelnaya Rosa, the Steel Rose, for her beauty was matched only by her deadly precision in combat. But precision meant nothing when you couldn't hit what you were aiming at. "Comrade Captain," called out Senior Lieutenant Yelena Zaitseva, her gunner and closest friend, "the new American machines have arrived at Sortovala Depot. Command wants us to inspect them." Svetlana spit into the snow. "More foreign junk, as if we haven't wasted enough time with British Matildas that break down every 50 kilometers. The 7th Guards Women's Tank Regiment had been formed 8 months earlier, much to the skepticism of the male-dominated Red Army Tank Corps. But after Svetlana's unit destroyed 43 German tanks during the defense of Leningrad, even the most stubborn generals had to admit that gender meant nothing behind the controls of a T-34. But now they faced a different kind of war. The Germans had learned to fear Soviet armor and had developed new tactics, concealed anti-tank positions, coordinated artillery strikes, and deadly Panzerfaust teams that could knock out a tank from close range. The old Soviet method of charging forward with guns blazing was becoming suicidal. 3 days later, Svetlana found herself standing in a snow-covered depot outside the town of Sortovala, staring at the strangest tanks she had ever seen. Unlike the angular, practical design of Soviet armor, these American M4A2 Shermans looked almost comfortable. Their turrets were rounded, their hulls seemed spacious, and they bore the 5-pointed star of the Red Army hastily painted over American markings. "They look like tractors," muttered Tank Commander Nadezhda Orlova, a grizzled veteran who had fought at Moscow and Stalingrad. But it was Master Sergeant Katya Fedorova, the regiment's chief mechanic, who first noticed something unusual. "Comrade Captain," she called out, her head buried deep in the Sherman's turret. "This electrical system, it's like nothing I've ever seen. There are gyroscopes, hydraulic pumps, and these strange sensor devices connected to the gun mounting." The depot commander, Major Alexei Ryzhkov, had been dreading this moment. Moscow had specifically ordered that the Women's Tank Regiment receive priority access to the new American equipment, but he doubted these girls could handle such sophisticated machinery. "The American advisors left detailed manuals, but they're all in English. Perhaps you'd prefer to stick with your T-34s until we can find male crews better suited for—" The major's words died in his throat as Svetlana's ice-blue eyes fixed on him with deadly intensity. She had faced down German Panzer commanders and SS officers. One sexist depot major wasn't going to intimidate her. "We'll take 5 Shermans for immediate testing," she said calmly. "And Major, the next time you suggest that Soviet women can't handle advanced equipment, remember that we were driving tanks while you were still pushing papers in Arkhangelsk." The first test drive was scheduled for dawn the next morning. Svetlana climbed into the commander's position of Sherman No. 237, nicknamed Sevyorny Veter, Northern Wind, by her crew. Yelena took the gunner's seat, while Private Marina Kozlova, barely 18 and fresh from tank school, served as the driver. What struck Svetlana immediately was the space. Soviet tanks were notorious for their cramped interiors, but the Sherman felt almost luxurious by comparison. There were actual seats instead of metal benches, the periscopes provided a clearer view than anything in a T-34, and most surprisingly, there was a radio that worked without constant adjustment. American bourgeois comfort, Yelena joked, but even she seemed impressed by the gun sight's clarity. Marina started the engine, a smooth, quiet diesel that purred like a contented cat. Soviet tank engines roared and coughed. This one seemed to whisper. And as they rolled out onto the test range, Svetlana began to understand why the Americans had such a reputation for mechanical reliability. But it was what happened next that changed everything they thought they knew about tank warfare. The test protocol was simple. Engage wooden targets at distances of 500, 800, and 1,200 meters while moving at various speeds. In a T-34, this was an exercise in futility. Soviet doctrine emphasized getting close to the enemy and overwhelming them with numbers and determination. Accurate gunnery while moving was considered impossible.
British Hitler himself had reviewed Dr. Zimmerman's report in December 1942, scrawling approving comments in the margins. "The mongrel democracy reveals its weakness," he had written next to the section on political constraints. "Germans fight with blood and iron. Americans fight with committees and factory workers." This analysis became holy doctrine. German war planning throughout 1943 and early 1944 assumed that American ground forces would peak at roughly 4 million soldiers total, with no more than 2 million ever deployed to European theaters. It was a reasonable estimate based on historical precedent, demographic science, and everything German military academies had taught about the limitations of democratic warfare. Dr. Zimmerman's calculations had been based on the finest German scholarship available. She had studied the American Civil War, noting that the Union had peaked at approximately 2.8 million soldiers despite facing an existential threat. She had analyzed World War I American mobilization, observing that the United States had fielded only 4.7 million military personnel over the entire course of the conflict, with peak simultaneous strength of 2.4 million. Every historical precedent supported her mathematical conclusions. What neither Dr. Zimmerman nor her colleagues could have anticipated was that they were not analyzing a conventional democracy preparing for a conventional war. They were studying a sleeping industrial giant about to undergo the most complete societal transformation in human history. The first hints that something was wrong began reaching German intelligence in the spring of 1943, but they were dismissed as Allied disinformation. Captain Klaus Richter, an intelligence officer attached to the German embassy in neutral Switzerland, had intercepted American radio transmissions discussing military unit formations that seemed to exceed Dr. Zimmerman's projections. "The Americans are claiming to have activated over 200 individual regiments," Richter had reported to Berlin in May 1943. "If accurate, this suggests ground forces approaching 6 million men, which contradicts our demographic analysis by more than 100%. Dr. Zimmerman had personally reviewed Richter's intercepts and dismissed them in a confidential memo to General Jodl. "Captain Richter has intercepted obvious disinformation designed to inflate American military strength. The numbers he reports would require the United States to conscript nearly 30% of their military-age population, while simultaneously maintaining industrial production. This is mathematically impossible for any democratic society." She had been supremely confident in her analysis because it was based on the best German understanding of how societies functioned under stress. German social scientists had studied democratic limitations for decades, observing how political constraints prevented optimal resource allocation. The Americans, with their competing political parties, labor unions, and individual rights, simply could not achieve the mobilization efficiency that characterized National Socialist Germany. By the autumn of 1943, however, the evidence of something unprecedented was becoming harder to ignore. Major Ernst Weber, a logistics specialist with Army Group South in Italy, had been capturing increasing numbers of American prisoners whose unit designations didn't match German intelligence files. "I have personally interrogated soldiers from the 36th, 45th, 88th, and 91st Infantry Divisions," Weber had reported to OKW in October 1943. "According to our order of battle estimates, these units should not exist. The 91st Division alone represents 15,000 men who exceed our projected American deployment to the Mediterranean theater." Dr. Zimmerman had traveled to Italy personally to investigate Weber's claims. Her subsequent report, classified as most secret and distributed only to the highest levels of German command, revealed the first cracks in her analytical certainty. "Major Weber's observations are accurate," she had written. "American forces in Italy demonstrate organizational capacity exceeding our baseline projections. However, this likely represents a temporary surge achieved by stripping forces from Pacific operations and homeland defense. The Americans cannot sustain such deployment levels without compromising other strategic priorities." She had maintained her core assessment while acknowledging the disturbing evidence. Total American mobilization may temporarily exceed 4 million during peak operational periods, but demographic constraints ensure this cannot be sustained beyond 18 to 24 months without economic collapse. Dr. Zimmerman's revised estimates still assumed that American society would reach a breaking point where industrial needs and military recruitment would create an irreconcilable conflict. German economic theory held that democratic systems could not maintain both massive military forces and adequate production simultaneously. One would have to give way to the other. The flaw in this reasoning was that Dr. Zimmerman was analyzing American society through the lens of German experience. She understood how industrial mobilization worked in a resource-constrained environment where choices between military and civilian production were zero-sum propositions. What she could not comprehend was an economy of such abundance that traditional either-or decisions became obsolete. Lieutenant Colonel Gerhard Sommer, a former economics professor from the University of Vienna, who served as Dr. Zimmerman's senior researcher, had begun to suspect that their fundamental assumptions might be flawed by early 1944. His private correspondence with Dr. Zimmerman, later captured by Allied forces, revealed a growing unease with their demographic models.
"Even if we could build them," Gotcha admitted, "training our mechanics to maintain and repair such systems would take months we don't have." As February 1943 approached, the strategic situation around Medvezhegorsk was becoming critical. German forces had constructed a series of fortified positions called the Karelian Line, featuring interlocking fields of fire from concealed anti-tank guns, pre-registered artillery positions, and carefully planned killing zones that had stopped 3 previous Soviet offensives. Traditional Soviet tank tactics, massed charges supported by infantry, had proven suicidal against these defenses. The Germans would allow the T-34s to advance into carefully prepared ambushes, then destroy them with concentrated anti-tank fire before they could respond effectively. But what if there was another way? General Pavel Kurochkin, commander of the Northwestern Front, had been following the reports about American tank stabilizers with growing interest. Unlike the political officers in Moscow, Kurochkin was a practical soldier who cared more about winning battles than ideological purity. "Captain Volkov," he said during a secure telephone conversation, "I'm giving you authorization to organize a combat test of these American machines. Choose your best crews and develop tactics that take advantage of their capabilities." The order was both an opportunity and a death sentence. Success would validate everything Svetlana had reported about the Sherman's capabilities. Failure would not only discredit the American tanks, but probably end her military career, assuming she survived to have a career. The next 2 weeks were a blur of intensive training as Svetlana's crews learned to fight in an entirely new way. Instead of the traditional Soviet approach of closing to point-blank range, they practiced engaging targets at maximum range while moving at high speed. The stabilized guns allowed them to fire accurately while advancing, retreating, or moving laterally, tactics that would be impossible in conventional tanks. But the Shermans weren't just about the stabilizer. American engineering had included dozens of smaller improvements that collectively transformed the combat experience. The radios actually worked reliably, allowing unprecedented coordination between tanks. The engines started in sub-zero temperatures without the elaborate preheating procedures required by Soviet tanks. The gun sights were clearer and more precise than anything in the Red Army inventory. Most importantly, the crews discovered that they could think and fight differently. Instead of relying on raw courage and revolutionary fervor, they could use tactics, precision, and technology to overcome German advantages. "We're not just learning to use new tanks," Yelena observed during one training session. "We're learning to be different kinds of soldiers." As the combat test approached, word had spread through the Red Army's command structure about the magical American tanks and their female crews. Some officers were quietly hoping for success that might break the stalemate around Medvezhegorsk. Others were actively hoping for failure that would discredit both foreign equipment and women in combat roles. The pressure was enormous. Svetlana found herself representing not just new technology, but the capabilities of Soviet women in combat. A single failure could be used to justify removing women from tank crews and rejecting American equipment simultaneously. "No pressure, Stelnaya Rosa," joked Nadezhda Orlova, but her voice carried genuine concern. "Just the future of Soviet armored warfare and women's military service resting on your shoulders." The night before the attack, Svetlana stood alone beside her Sherman, running her hand along the cold steel of the turret. Somewhere beyond the frozen forests, German soldiers were preparing their own defenses, confident that their anti-tank guns and tactical superiority would stop another futile Soviet assault. They had no idea that American engineering was about to change the rules of the game. But would the gyroscopic stabilizer prove itself when bullets started flying and lives hung in the balance? Could technology overcome tactics, training, and the brutal realities of winter warfare? The answer would come with the dawn, when Sherman tanks with red stars would advance against the Karelian line in the ultimate test of American innovation versus German steel. The Soviets were skeptical of American black magic, but as dawn broke over the Karelian Peninsula on February 15, 1943, Captain Svetlana Volkov was about to prove that sometimes magic is just superior engineering. The gyroscopic stabilizer was about to face its ultimate test, not against wooden targets, but against the deadly Karelian line where German anti-tank guns had stopped 3 Soviet offensives cold. At 0500 hours, 5 Sherman M4A2 tanks with red stars painted hastily over American markings rolled through the pre-dawn darkness toward the German positions at Hill 347, nicknamed Death's Door by Soviet intelligence. The hill commanded the approach to Medvezhegorsk have been bristled with concealed PaK-40 anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and carefully planned killing zones.
British Svetlana's voice crackled through the radio network, a luxury that Soviet tank crews had never experienced in T-34s. "All units, this is Steel Rose. Remember, we are not charging like mad bulls today. We are hunters, and precision is our weapon." In Sherman's Severnaya Vetter, Yelena Zaitseva peered through the stabilized gun sight, watching the crosshairs remain perfectly steady despite the tank's movement over rough terrain. After months in T-34s where hitting anything beyond 400 meters while moving was pure luck, this felt like wielding a magic wand. "Contact, German anti-tank gun, 1,100 meters, behind the fallen birch trees," she called out. In a conventional attack, Soviet tanks would have charged straight at the position, absorbing casualties until they could overwhelm the Germans with numbers and revolutionary fervor. But the Shermans allowed for something unprecedented. They could fight while moving, engaging enemies at distances where return fire was far less effective.
All units, advance in line formation, maintain 200-meter intervals. Engage targets of opportunity, but keep moving. Do not, repeat, do not stop to fight. The German anti-tank crews had been watching Soviet tactics for 2 years. They knew exactly when the T-34s would appear, exactly how they would attack, and exactly where to position their guns for maximum effectiveness. They were not prepared for what happened next. At 1,200 meters, far beyond the effective range of German anti-tank guns, the first Sherman fired. The 75mm shell, guided by the gyroscopic stabilizer's mechanical precision, struck the concealed Pak-40 position with devastating accuracy. Before the German crew could even identify the threat, their gun was smoking wreckage. "Impossible," muttered Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, commanding the neighboring anti-tank position. "Soviet tanks cannot hit anything at that range, especially while moving." But the impossible continued to unfold before his horrified eyes. Tank after tank fired with mechanical precision while advancing at speeds that should have made accurate gunnery unthinkable. The carefully prepared German defensive positions, designed to stop close-range Soviet charges, were being picked apart from distances where they couldn't effectively return fire. In Sherman Grozny Storm, Terrible Storm, Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Orlova watched her gunner, Sergeant Tanya Volosina, methodically destroy target after target. "It's like shooting fish in a barrel," Tanya breathed in amazement. "The gun stays exactly where I point it, no matter how fast we're moving." But the real test came when German Panzer IVs emerged from concealed positions to counterattack. These were experienced crews who had fought on the Eastern Front for over a year, and they immediately recognized that something was fundamentally different about this Soviet attack. "Achtung! Enemy tanks engaging at extended range with impossible accuracy," radioed Hauptmann Ernst Weber, commanding the German tank platoon. "Request immediate artillery support." The Panzer IV was theoretically superior to the Sherman in both armor and firepower. Its long-barreled 75mm gun could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges where the Sherman's shorter gun would be ineffective. In a conventional tank-versus-tank duel, the Germans held every advantage except one: they couldn't hit what they couldn't catch. Svetlana's tactical revolution was simple but devastating. Instead of engaging in static gun duels where German technical superiority would dominate, the Shermans used their stabilized guns to fight while moving. They would fire accurate shots while advancing, retreating, or moving laterally, never presenting a stationary target for German gunners. Target: Panzer IV, 900 meters, moving left to right behind the stone wall, Yelena called out as their Sherman raced across the frozen battlefield at 30 kilometers per hour. The gyroscopic stabilizer automatically compensated for the tank's movement, keeping the gun trained on the target with mechanical precision that no human gunner could match. The 75mm shell struck the Panzer IV's turret ring, penetrating the armor and detonating the ammunition storage. "Mein Gott," whispered the German radio operator before his transmission cut to static. What the Germans were witnessing wasn't just superior American technology, it was a complete revolution in armored tactics. The Soviets were no longer bound by the traditional limitations of tank warfare. They could engage multiple targets while moving, maintain accurate fire while maneuvering, and coordinate complex tactical movements that would have been impossible without reliable radio communications. As the battle intensified, the true genius of American engineering became apparent. The gyroscopic stabilizer wasn't just a single component, it was part of an integrated fire control system that transformed the Sherman into a mobile gun platform unlike anything the world had ever seen. Inside Severnaya Vedr, Katya Fedorova watched in fascination as the stabilization system responded to each movement of the tank. When they hit a shell crater and the hull pitched violently forward, hydraulic pumps immediately adjusted the gun's elevation to compensate. When they swerved to avoid German return fire and the tank rolled to the left, the system automatically corrected for the lateral movement. It's like having a mechanical gunner who never gets tired, never gets scared, and never makes mistakes. No matter what we do, the gun stays exactly where Yelena aims it.
But the system's true test came when German artillery began falling around the advancing Shermans. Conventional Soviet tactics would have required the tanks to stop, take cover, and wait for the barrage to end. The stabilized Shermans could do something unprecedented. They could continue fighting while evading artillery fire. "All units, serpentine movement. Maintain fire on designated targets," Svetlana commanded as 8 88mm shells began exploding around her tank. The Shermans wove across the battlefield in unpredictable patterns, never presenting a stationary target for German gunners, but their stabilized guns continued to track and engage enemies with deadly accuracy. It was a display of tactical capability that would have been pure fantasy just hours earlier. While the gyroscopic stabilizer provided the technical capability, it was the crew's adaptation to this new form of warfare that made the difference. Yelena Zaitseva, who had spent months struggling with the limitations of T-34 gun sights, found herself able to engage targets with precision that seemed almost supernatural. "I can actually see what I'm shooting at," she marveled during a brief lull in the fighting. "The sight doesn't bounce, the target doesn't jump around, and I can take time to aim properly even while we're moving at full speed." Marina Kozlova, the young driver, discovered that Arakan engineering had made her job easier as well. The Sherman's transmission was smooth and responsive compared to the crude gear systems in Soviet tanks. She could make subtle steering adjustments that kept the gun on target while maneuvering around obstacles and enemy fire. But it was Anna Morozova, monitoring German radio communications, who first realized the psychological impact of their new tactics. "Comrade Captain, German communications are becoming increasingly panicked. They keep reporting impossible Soviet accuracy and requesting immediate reinforcements." The Germans had built their defensive doctrine around the predictable nature of Soviet tank attacks. They knew how T-34s fought, where they would attack, and how to counter their tactics effectively. But the stabilized Shermans were fighting in ways that broke every rule of Eastern Front warfare. As the battle progressed, Svetlana's crews discovered capability after capability that the gyroscopic stabilizer enabled. They could engage targets while backing away from threats, maintaining accurate fire during tactical retreats that would have been impossible in conventional tanks. They could fight while moving laterally, picking off German positions from unexpected angles. Most importantly, they could coordinate complex tactical maneuvers while maintaining continuous fire support. The reliable American radios allowed unprecedented communication between tanks, while the stabilized guns ensured that each Sherman could contribute effective fire regardless of its movement. "Form line abreast, advance toward the village at 15 kilometers per hour, engage targets of opportunity, but maintain formation integrity." The 5 Shermans swept across the battlefield like a mechanical cavalry charge, their guns speaking with rhythmic precision. German defensive positions that had stopped 3 previous Soviet offensives crumbled before this new form of warfare. Oberst Heinrich Miller, commanding the defensive sector, watched his carefully prepared positions disintegrate with growing horror. "These are not the same Soviet tanks we fought last month. They're engaging at ranges and with accuracy that should be impossible. Request immediate tactical assessment and reinforcements." The decisive moment came when German reinforcements, a company of Panzer IVs and Sturmgeschütz IIIs, attempted a coordinated counterattack against what they assumed were conventional Soviet tanks. The German commanders had dealt with T-34s before and knew exactly how to defeat them. Close-range engagement, where superior German armor and firepower would dominate. But as the German armor advanced, they encountered something unprecedented in Eastern Front warfare. The Soviet tanks didn't charge forward to meet them in close combat. Instead, they maintained distance and engaged with devastating accuracy while maneuvering in coordinated patterns that kept them beyond effective German gun range. "Target, Sturmgeschütz, 1,000 meters, hull down behind the farmhouse," Yelena called out as their Sherman circled the German position at high speed. The stabilized gun tracked the target smoothly, compensating automatically for the tank's movement. The 75mm shell penetrated the assault gun's frontal armor, and another German vehicle exploded in flames. "It's like we're fighting from the future," whispered Tanya Voloshina in Grozny Storm, as she methodically destroyed German positions that couldn't effectively return fire. The German counterattack collapsed within 30 minutes. Vehicles that had dominated Eastern Front battlefields for 2 years were being systematically destroyed by Soviet tanks fighting with capabilities that seemed to violate the laws of physics. As news of the victory spread through Soviet command channels, the implications extended far beyond a single successful battle. The gyroscopic stabilizer had proven that American engineering could provide capabilities that Soviet manufacturing couldn't match. But more importantly, it demonstrated that technology could multiply the effectiveness of Soviet tactics rather than replace them. General Kuroshkin, monitoring the battle from his headquarters, watched as German positions that had held for months fell to a single reinforced tank company. "Get me Moscow on the secure line," he ordered. "They need to understand what we've witnessed here."
But the victory came with uncomfortable truths that Soviet ideology struggled to accept. The Americans had developed technology that was genuinely superior to anything the Red Army possessed. The gyroscopic stabilizer, the reliable radios, the precision optics, all represented manufacturing capabilities that Soviet industry couldn't duplicate. Political officer Major Boris Khrushchev, who had questioned the magical American capabilities just weeks earlier, found himself writing reports that praised the stabilized Shermans while carefully avoiding any suggestion that American technology might be superior to Soviet engineering. The heroic crews of the 7th Guards Women's Tank Regiment have demonstrated that revolutionary spirit, combined with appropriate technical support from our American allies, can overcome any fascist defensive position, he wrote, the careful phrasing reflecting the ideological complexity of the situation. The victory at Hill 347 had proven more than just the effectiveness of American technology. It had demonstrated that Soviet women could not only operate complex military equipment, but could innovate tactically in ways that male-dominated units had not achieved. Svetlana Volkov found herself summoned to Moscow for debriefing with the General Staff, becoming the first woman tank commander to brief senior Soviet leadership on advanced armored tactics. Her tactical innovations, using stabilized guns to fight while maneuvering, coordinating complex movements while maintaining continuous fire support, would become standard doctrine for Sherman-equipped units throughout the Red Army. "Comrade Captain," said Marshal Georgy Zhukov during her debriefing, "your tactical innovations have demonstrated capabilities that we never imagined possible. How quickly can we train other units to fight using these methods?" The question revealed the central challenge. The gyroscopic stabilizer wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was an enabler of entirely new tactical concepts that required extensive retraining and fundamental changes in how Soviet armor operated. Over the following months, as more Sherman tanks equipped with gyroscopic stabilizers reached Soviet units, the impact on Eastern Front warfare became undeniable. Tank units that had previously suffered devastating losses in frontal assaults could now engage German positions with precision and survive to fight another day. Katya Fedorova became the Red Army's leading expert on American stabilization technology, eventually establishing training programs that taught Soviet mechanics to maintain and repair the complex systems. Her technical manuals, written in clear Russian and illustrated with detailed diagrams, made the mysterious American technology accessible to Soviet technical personnel. "The gyroscope is like a mechanical brain that never gets confused," she explained to new Sherman crews. "It knows exactly where the gun should point, and it makes the corrections faster than any human gunner could think." But the broader impact extended beyond the battlefield.
The stabilized Shermans provided Soviet forces with a tactical flexibility that changed the nature of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. Instead of relying solely on mass charges and overwhelming numbers, Soviet tank units could now use precision, coordination, and technological superiority to achieve their objectives. German forces initially struggled to develop effective counter-tactics against the stabilized Shermans. Traditional anti-tank positions designed to engage predictably advancing Soviet armor at close range proved vulnerable to accurate fire from distances beyond their effective response range. Captured German documents revealed the psychological impact of facing tanks that could fire accurately while moving. The Soviet tanks engage with impossible precision while maneuvering at high speed. Our conventional tactics are ineffective against these new capabilities. Some German units attempted to adapt by increasing the range at which they engaged Soviet armor, but this strategy was limited by the relatively short range of their anti-tank guns compared to the Sherman's 75mm cannon guided by gyroscopic precision. The Germans also discovered that their traditional tactic of using terrain and concealment to compensate for numerical inferiority was less effective against tanks that could engage accurately while moving. The Shermans could fire effectively while advancing, retreating, or maneuvering laterally, making it impossible to predict where they would be when return fire arrived. By the spring of 1943, Soviet Sherman units had established a combat record that exceeded all expectations. Tank battalions that had previously suffered casualty rates of 60 to 70% in offensive operations found that they could achieve their objectives while maintaining unit integrity and combat effectiveness. The 7th Guards Women's Tank Regiment, under Svetlana Volkov's command, became the most decorated Sherman unit in the Red Army, with individual crew members earning multiple combat decorations for actions that would have been impossible without gyroscopic stabilization technology. "We stopped thinking like cavalry and started thinking like artillery," Yelena Zaitseva reflected years later. "The stabilizer let us be precise instead of just brave." The technological revolution extended beyond the battlefield. Soviet engineers, inspired by American gyroscopic systems, began developing indigenous stabilization technology that would eventually appear in post-war Soviet tank designs. While they couldn't immediately duplicate American manufacturing precision, they understood the principles and began working towards Soviet solutions. The Sherman's gyroscopic stabilizer proved that the gap between American and Soviet technology was wider than anyone had imagined. But it also demonstrated that Soviet crews could not only operate advanced equipment, but could innovate tactically in ways that maximized its effectiveness. The 4,100 Sherman tanks provided through Lend-Lease represented only 8% of total Soviet tank strength, but their impact far exceeded their numerical contribution. Units equipped with stabilized Shermans achieved breakthrough capabilities that fundamentally changed how the Red Army conducted armored operations. American engineering had provided the tools, but Soviet tactical innovation had transformed those tools into war-winning capabilities. The gyroscopic stabilizer was just a mechanical device, a spinning wheel connected to hydraulic pumps and electrical circuits. But in the hands of crews who understood its potential, it became something approaching the black magic that German soldiers had reported. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Soviet Union quickly phased out most of its Sherman tanks. The complex American systems were difficult to maintain without American spare parts and technical support, and Soviet industry was capable of producing T-34s in quantities that made foreign tanks unnecessary. But the lessons learned from gyroscopic stabilization technology lived on. Post-war Soviet tank designs incorporated stabilization systems based on principles pioneered in American Shermans. The T-54, T-55, and subsequent Soviet tanks all featured gun stabilization technology that traced its conceptual origins to the American gyroscopes that had stunned Soviet crews in 1943. Svetlana Volkov continued her military career, eventually becoming the first woman to achieve the rank of colonel in Soviet armored forces. She never forgot the moment when she first witnessed a Sherman firing accurately while moving at full speed, describing it as the moment when tank warfare left the 19th century and entered the 20th. Today, modern main battle tanks routinely fire accurately while moving at speeds that would have seemed impossible in 1943. Computer-controlled gun stabilization systems provide precision that makes World War II gyroscopic stabilizers seem primitive. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged: the ability to fight while moving, to engage targets while maneuvering, to combine mobility with firepower in ways that multiply tactical effectiveness. The gyroscopic stabilizer was more than just a technical innovation. It was a glimpse into the future of armored warfare, a demonstration that mechanical precision could enhance human capabilities rather than replace them, and proved that sometimes the most important revolutions come not from ideology, but from engineering excellence applied to the ancient art of war. The American black magic had proven to be neither magic nor purely American. It was human ingenuity applied to mechanical systems, creating capabilities that transcended national boundaries and ideological differences in the service of defeating fascism and changing the nature of warfare forever.